Preparations for D-Day were complete. Troops were already aboard ships. The assault timetable had been confirmed for June 5, 1944. The invasion depended on three linked moves: bombing the coast, dropping airborne troops inland, and landing the main force on the beaches of Normandy. But then the weather changed. By June 3rd, conditions over the English Channel and Normandy were worsening. Wind was rising, cloud was thickening. The invasion plan was in place, but the weather conditions it depended upon were not. The decision over whether to proceed now depended on James Stagg, Eisenhower's chief weather advisor for D-Day. But the forecasters Stagg relied upon were not giving him a clear answer. One group argued that the weather might improve enough for the landing to proceed, while another warned that low cloud and worsening conditions could reduce bombing accuracy, disrupt the airborne operation, and weaken support over the beaches. But there was no time left to settle the argument. Eisenhower needed one answer, and Stagg had to provide it before June 5th could either be confirmed or postponed. The problem was no longer assembling the invasion force. It was whether Eisenhower would launch the largest amphibious assault in history, on a forecast his own experts still disputed. Because once the date for D-Day had been fixed, delay became part of the danger. The Allied plan was not simply to put men on the beaches of Normandy. It was to establish a foothold ashore and reinforce it faster than the defending German forces could crush it. Allied planners called that foothold the lodgment, which meant the weather had to support not only the initial assault, but the buildup of reinforcements behind it. So the landings were only the beginning of Operation Overlord. The Allies then had to move in vehicles, fuel, ammunition, supplies, and more troops at rapid pace before German forces could launch a concentrated counterattack. A bad forecast could therefore do more than just damage D-Day. It could compromise the lodgment before it was secure. On May 8th, Eisenhower had formally fixed D-Day for June 5th, 1944. But that date had not been chosen casually. The convoys had to cross at night. The airborne troops needed moonlight, and the tide had to expose the beach obstacles while still leaving enough water for the assault craft. That narrowed the viable window with the right moon and tide conditions to June 5th to 7th. After that, the next useful opportunity wasn't until June 19th to 21st. The calendar was tight, but the military timetable was even tighter. Allied planners assumed that by the end of D+1, the Germans would know that Normandy, not the Pas-de-Calais, was the main invasion front. By D+4 or D+5, strong German forces, including panzer divisions, could be in position to counterattack. Air power, rapid unloading, and immediate reinforcement were therefore not optional. They were necessary to keep the lodgment alive. So the Allies knew when D-Day could be attempted, but they still did not know if the weather inside that narrow window would allow the plan to work. That decision now depended on the forecasting teams, and those teams were divided. Stagg's position was difficult because he was not issuing an independent forecast from a single office. He had to weigh competing judgments from the British Met Office, the Admiralty, and the American Air Force team, then present Eisenhower with one recommendation. So before Eisenhower could make a decision, Stagg first had to turn disagreement into a single usable answer. But the teams were divided for a reason. The American team was more willing to trust longer-range forecasting, whereas the British forecasters were less confident that the weather over the English Channel could be predicted that far in advance. Therefore, Stagg first had to judge the forecast system itself before he could judge the weather. The weather only had to fail in one place to endanger the whole plan. Rough seas threatened the crossing, but low cloud threatened more than that. It could reduce bombing accuracy, complicate the airborne drops, and weaken bombing and naval gunfire support over the beaches during the opening assault. By the night of June 3rd, 1944, the assault timetable was no longer a plan, it was already in motion. Troops were aboard ships, ports were congested, and minesweepers were clearing the channel ahead of the fleet. The operation still needed one final weather decision, but everything else was moving toward launch on June 5th. Then the forecast began to collapse. The weather the invasion depended upon was worsening, and Stagg still had no answer Eisenhower could safely act on. If that did not change before dawn on June 4th, the Allies would have to choose between two dangers: launch into worsening conditions or try to stop an operation already in motion. At a commander's meeting on June 4th, Stagg presented the forecast, and Eisenhower decided that the planned assault for June 5th could not go ahead. D-Day was postponed for 24 hours, with another review scheduled for later that evening. Despite the difficulty of halting such a major operation, the recall was vindicated almost immediately. As the day went on, the weather worsened enough to justify Eisenhower's decision to stop the assault. But postponement now had visible costs of its own. Troops remained confined aboard crowded vessels. The fleet had to recover from the recall, and the invasion was being held between relaunch and further delay while the commanders waited for the next forecast. But the postponement gave the Allies one immediate advantage, as it also pushed German expectations in the wrong direction. Field Marshal Rommel, commander of Army Group B and responsible for defending the Channel coast against an Allied landing, was told by his meteorologist that no invasion looked imminent. So on June 4th, Rommel left his headquarters for Germany to visit his wife for her birthday and then see Hitler about releasing more reserves. Everything now depended on what Stagg would bring to the next Allied commanders' meeting that evening. What Stagg possessed was not the answer he wanted, but a possibility. At Blacksod Point on Ireland's Atlantic coast, the pressure readings had begun to rise. That mattered because Blacksod lay roughly 450 miles northwest of the Normandy beaches, so it gave Allied forecasters an early indication of what incoming Atlantic weather might do before it reached Britain, the English Channel, and Normandy. The emerging forecast suggested a short, usable break, late on June 5th and through much of June 6th. But it looked like a brief opening, not a lasting change in the weather. Stagg reported at the evening commanders' meeting at Suffolk House that once the cold front had cleared the Channel, the Allies should get a short spell of improved weather. The opening would be brief, but it might still be enough. Ramsey immediately turned that forecast into a deadline. As the naval commander for Operation Neptune, the code name given to the naval assault phase of D-Day, he warned that Admiral Kirk, who commanded the assault task forces, had to be told within the next half hour if the invasion was to proceed on June 6th. Another recall would likely cost them the next day as well, which would mean losing the first June window, the one built around the moon and tide conditions from June 5th to 7th, and pushing their operation back to June 19th at the earliest. Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, thought it was the best break they were likely to get, but Lee Mallory was less convinced. As the senior air commander for the invasion, he warned that Bomber Command would still struggle to mark its targets and bomb effectively. Tedder, sitting beside Eisenhower as his deputy, broadly agreed that the heavier bomber effort would remain uncertain. But Montgomery, who was responsible for the land assault once the troops went ashore, was blunt. Go. Eisenhower now had to decide whether the risk of acting was less than the risk of delay. At 21:45 on June 4th, Eisenhower decided that the largest amphibious assault in history would proceed on June 6th, 1944. There would be no further delay. Within little more than an hour, the order had gone out for the invasion fleet to resume operations, and by 2300, the ships were once again heading for France. Although a decision had been made, it was not a moment of certainty. It was still a gamble. What Eisenhower had just set back in motion was enormous. Nearly 7,000 ships and craft, more than 150,000 men, and thousands of aircraft assigned to cover, strike, and support the assault. What that gamble bought the Allies was not safety, but a better chance where the operation most needed it. In the crossing, in the airborne drops inland, in the bombing and naval gunfire support over the beaches, and in the race to build the lodgment before German counterattacks struck back in force. What Stagg and the forecasters provided wasn't a promise. It did not give Eisenhower calm seas. clear skies, or certainty. But what it did give them was a short interval that was usable enough to launch. That opening did not make D-Day safe, but it made it possible. And that opening made possible not just the assault itself, but the machinery needed to sustain it. It carried the system meant to keep the lodgment supplied. Giant Phoenix caissons sunk to form harbor walls. Old ships deliberately scuttled offshore to form a barrier against the sea and to create calmer water behind them, and floating piers with roadways built to carry cargo from ship to beach without a captured port. D-Day itself was still fought in difficult weather, but the crossing held, the support arrived, and by the end of June 6th, more than 130,000 men had landed in Normandy. The result was D-Day forced Hitler into the two-front war he had long feared. Germany was already locked in a brutal struggle with the Soviet Union in the east, and now the West was open as well. By late August, Paris was liberated, and within a year, Hitler was dead, and the war in Europe had ended. Years later, on January 20th, 1961, as John F. Kennedy rode with Eisenhower to the Capitol on his inauguration day, he asked why the Normandy invasion had succeeded. Eisenhower gave him the simplest explanation of all: because the Allies had better meteorologists than the Germans. If you want more videos on World War II's turning points and the decisions that shaped them, like this video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel.